Welcome, geometry students, to section 1.7, midpoint and distance. I think I'm going to break this up into two parts. The first part we're going to do, midpoint. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. The midpoint formula. Well, I could just give you the formula and you'll have it, but I think it's better to understand where the formula comes from. Pause. If you don't want to hear that, be one of those people and skip ahead, but whatever, okay? But this next section is going to be an explanation. Remember, understanding, you won't have to memorize the formula because you'll understand how to do it. Unpause. Okay, so getting right into it, the first thing we need to understand is what is a midpoint. This is a measure of center. Okay, a measure of center. Don't have to write this down. I just want to kind of write this down for myself mostly. Measure of center. So when we're talking about measures of center, we're talking about, for example, average, the average of something. If I take the ages of everyone in the room, and there's a 15, there's a 16, a 15, 15, a 14, a 15, a 16, and those are the ages of the people in the room, the average, there's a good chance that it's around 15 years old. Okay? Now, how do you find the average of something? The average is equal to the sum of the data points, so sum of data, divided by the number of data, or data. I don't know what you want to call it. Okay, so the sum of data divided by the number of data. That's just, okay, we're going to be referring to this. I know you're thinking, what the heck, we're not doing stats? We're doing midpoint. So where's the midpoint? Allow me to get into that now. Okay, now let's just take this red bar. Okay, red bar. This is the only thing on the screen right now. How would you find the midpoint of this bar? Well, you need to count and see how long it is. Okay, so in this case, we start at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now the midpoint is going to be 3. Why? Because 3 is the halfway point. It's half of 6. So this is going to be our midpoint. What's another way to think of this? Well, we could find the average between 0 and 6. So the average of 0 and 6 is 0 plus 6. We find the sum, and then we divide it by the number of data points, 2. 6 divided by 2, 3. So you can see we did talk about average. It's essentially a way of talking about the midpoint of something. Okay. Now that's just a horizontal line. What about a vertical line? Well, you're going to do the same thing. Imagine we have this guy. Let me try to get it so it's the only thing on the screen. Oh, almost there. Oh, I can't do it. We're close enough. Okay, so let's call it 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Obviously, the midpoint is going to be 2. Okay, another way of thinking it is 4 plus 2 divided by the number of data points, 2, is equal to the average. 4 plus 2. I don't know where I came up with the 2 from. Sorry. 4 plus 0. This guy and this guy. 4 plus 0. And then we get 4 divided by 2 is 2. So 2 is the average, or 2 is the midpoint. Okay, so you can clearly see through distance and through using the average that we can find the midpoint of some straight lines relatively easily. Now here's the thing. Here's the kicker. What about a diagonal line? How do we do that? How do we count when it's on a diagonal? Well, you don't need to. What you can do is, because a diagonal line has a component that is horizontal, okay, and it also has a component that is vertical, we can simply find the midpoint of both the vertical component and the horizontal component, and that will tell us the midpoint of that diagonal line. Well, what do we call that horizontal component? We call that the x values. Okay, so this is the x-axis, so those are the x values. And what's the vertical component? The vertical component for the coordinate plane are the y values. So we can find the midpoint of the y values, and that will tell us our midpoint vertically. Combine the two, and we have our midpoint. Now, let's give some values to these endpoints here. So let's call A, we can call this point 2, comma, and then we'll call it 2, comma 2. Why not? Okay. Okay, now let's call B, let's call this 8, comma, how high does it go? We'll call it 6. So we have 2, comma 2, A, and then 8, comma 6, B. How do we find the midpoint of B? Well, let's go ahead and write here our x values on A. So this is my A value. This is A. And this is my B value. This is, what did I say? 8. Okay. Let me go over here to my vertical. And this is 2 again. And this is 6. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm going to find the midpoint between 8 and 2, and then 2 and 6. Okay, this is the same thing as average, but instead of writing average now, I'm going to write the midpoint. So the midpoint between 8 and 2 is I add 8 and 2, and I divide by the number of data points, which are 2. So I get 10 divided by 2, I get 5. Okay, so my midpoint for the x, for my horizontal, is 5. We're going to come back to that. Okay, now for blue. Okay, so the midpoint of the blue for my vertical, I do equal to 6 plus 2. Okay, it starts off at 2. I actually got it right this time. How about that? Divide by the number of data points, 2. So I get 6 plus 2 is 8 divided by 2, and that's 4. So my midpoint is 4. Now, what is my midpoint here? Well, if I had a perfectly drawn coordinate plane, which I kind of wish I had right now, but I don't, you would see that the coordinate here would be 5, 4. That would be the midpoint, because that's our x value midpoint. This is our midpoint of the x value, and this is our midpoint of the y value, which we call xm and ym. All right? And that's over here. And I wish I would have changed that to pink. So let me change that to pink. Well, you get the point. Okay, now let's review. What did I do with my xm and ym? Well, the first thing I did is I took for my horizontal distance, for my x value here, this is the first one we're doing, and let's make this, what color is it over there? Green. Okay, so I'll make this light green right here. So for this point, whoops, what I did is I took my first x value, we'll call this x1, that's my first x value, I added to my second x value, and then divided by 2, as it's demonstrated here. I added x1 plus x2, and I divided by 2, and that gave me 5. What did I do for the y values? Well, for my y values, I did basically the same thing. I took my second y value, or my first y value, added it to my second y value, and I got my ym. Look at this, check this out, ym. That looks ugly, whatever. So that's how I do that. Now, let's go ahead and jot this in. So for those people, this is your unpause, fast forward moment. Good for you guys. I do x1 plus x2 divided by 2 for ym. Let's make it purple, why not? y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So for my midpoint formula, I can find the midpoint of any 2 points. Again, you need 2 points here by doing, can I just make it all one color, please? Let's go this dark blue. x1 plus x2, and then y1 plus y2. So a big component of solving for a midpoint is you have to label your points first. Label first, okay? That's the most important thing. You have to label what you have, whether it's x1, y1, x2, y2, or sometimes, and this we're going to talk about this type of problem, xm, ym, if it gives you a midpoint instead, okay? Let's put it into practice. We don't need to draw it for this one. If you want, you can, but you really don't need to. So we're going to show here that we'll call this x1, x2, and we're asked to find the midpoint between these, y1 and y2. When it says find the midpoint, clearly we're given an endpoint, so these have to be endpoints. So we call them A and B if we want, and then find the midpoint M. So we could call, I mean, you don't have to do this, but these are endpoints. What color should I use? I don't know, this one. So these are endpoints. Okay, and we're looking for the midpoint. Now, how do you know which one's x1 and x2? It doesn't matter. If you're just adding them together, it doesn't matter if you call -4 x1 and 2 x2, because no matter which way you add them, it's going to be the same thing, okay? So over here, we're going to go over here and we'll write xm, and we know xm is equal to x1 plus x2 divided by 2. I like to do one at a time. So I know I'm going to do 2, that's my x1, plus -4, I put that in parentheses like that, and that's going to be my xm, okay? Equals 2 plus -4 is -2 divided by 2. That gives me -1. Now I have my xm. I'm halfway there. Let's go on to my ym. So my ym, let's use green again. Pink. Yeah, let's go pink. Ym, that's going to be equal to y1 plus y2 divided by 2. That's going to be equal to my values here. So my y2 is -8. If you want, you can put the parentheses. It doesn't really make a difference. And then y2 is 16. And I'm going to do dividing that by 2. Okay, so what do I get here? Well, for my ym, I'm going to get negative 8 plus 16 is positive 8 divided by 2. And I get 4. So my ym is 4. Therefore, my midpoint, okay, so this is my midpoint, and we'll just call it m, is going to be negative 1, comma, 4. That's my xm, and that is my ym. Now, quick thing of note. Oops. No one said anything. Look, that's supposed to say y1. I'm actually kind of glad that I made that mistake. Now, it's not super important which one you call x1, y1, or x2, y2, as long as the x1 is with the y1, okay? You can't call this one x1 and then call this one y2 as I just did, okay? You got to call one x1, y1, and you got to call this one x2, y2. The 2's and the 1's need to stay together. Otherwise, you're gonna mix it up. Luckily, I transferred it over and kept the y1 as negative 8, but you don't want to label it incorrectly. Remember, the first step, there's a big star, that means it's important, is label first. Let's make this blue inside there. Label first. Okay. So done with that problem, we have negative 1, comma 4. Now, this next problem, this is the classic curveball to trip you up on your test. Okay, Khan Academy, same thing. This is designed to confuse you intentionally. If you stick to your guns and you label correctly, this will be fine. There is just a little bit more of a component to it, which we'll talk about. Given 4, 1 is the midpoint of a line AB, and point A is negative 2, 7, find point B. So I kind of drew it here. It's not on a coordinate plane. It's on a flat surface, but you still get the point. We're given A. We're not given the other endpoint. Look at this. We don't know it, but we are given, that's weird, we are given the midpoint. Okay, so we have to label these correctly. Let's do that now. So I'm going to use purple here. I'm just going to stick with purple just so I don't spend all my time on the palette. Okay, so if this is a midpoint, I need to label this XM, YM, not X2, Y2, not X1, Y1, XM, YM. That is a critical step right here. If you do not do that step, the whole problem is going to end up phooey. Okay? Now, we can essentially just call A X1, Y1. That doesn't really matter there. And then if we call X1, Y1 for A, we need to call B X2, Y2. Okay? What you call A and B isn't too important. Just know that these are endpoints. If it has a 1 or a 2 next to it, it's an endpoint. Endpoint, okay? So 1 or 2 is an endpoint. But if it has a midpoint, it's XM, YM. Now, so let's go over here and label these points here. So we already called this one X1, Y1. We call this guy XM, YM, and X2, Y2. We are looking for it. Those are our unknowns. So we're just going to leave them like that. Now, what do we know? Well, we know that XM is equal to X1 plus X2. What do we know of this stuff? Well, we know XM. Look, on this side of the equal sign, we know XM is 4. And that is equal to X1, negative 2, plus X2, we don't know. We have to leave it because we don't know what that is, divided by 2. Okay? Notice here I left the endpoint blank this time. Let me change it, I don't know, red. I left the endpoint blank, and this time I knew the midpoint. This was given. So it changes the equation a little bit. Before, we just had to plug in on the right side. Oh, just type it in on the calculator, boom, 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 done. Okay, this one we actually have to do a little bit of solving, but it's a fairly straightforward process. It's pretty easy, and I'll show you what the process is. The first step we always do is we're going to multiply both sides by 2. So we get 8 equals negative 2 plus x2. This is our unknown. Okay, we need to add 2, add opposite. We get 10 equals x2, and we're done with our x-coordinate. Okay, so we have here 10 is our x-coordinate. All right, moving on to y's. Okay, any questions? All right, thank you. y1, y2, okay, is our formula here. So we're going to plug in what we know. We know that ym is equal to 1, and what else do we know? We know y1 is 7. We know y2 is unknown. We leave it as y2 divided by 2. First step we're always going to do, okay, we're trying to isolate y2. That's what we're going for. We're not looking for XM, so don't be plugging your midpoints. This is the most common mistake I see. People plugging in your midpoints in for X2 and Y2. Don't do that. Don't be one of those guys or gals. So I multiply by 2, I get 2 equals 7 plus Y2. Subtract 7 from both sides to isolate the Y, and I get negative 5 equals Y2. Okay, so now I have my other coordinate, which is negative 5, and I'm done. I found my endpoint. So be very careful on what it's asking for. Be very careful and read the problem. Labeling is going to be key. 10, negative 5 is my answer. Labeling. Okay, so if there's one lesson you learn from this, it's labeling. Feel free to join me for the next video, which is distance formula. I'm going to kind of break that down kind of like I did in this example. So be sure to watch the next video. Thanks for watching.